We'd like now to begin with our first set of panelists. The topic for this panel is the political dimensions of Proposition 13, and we have four extremely able and experienced people who've done excellent research and written on this topic, and so I'd like to begin with that. I will briefly introduce them, and then we will proceed in the order from right to left. Before I do that, though, in response to a question, I asked Mark DiCamillo if he would have any objection to making his PowerPoint presentations, those slides, generally available, and he's happy to do that. And so anyone who wants to look at them in more detail, they will be put on the IGS website. That's www.igs.berkeley.edu, and at some point, relatively shortly, they will be available to you. And thank you, Mark, for being willing to do that. Well, let me now begin by introducing the panelists. To my immediate right is John Fund, who's a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He writes a weekly column on the trail for opinionjournal.com, and his book, Stealing Elections, How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy, was published in 2004 by Encounter. And I think those of us who read the journal often see his op-ed columns and very penetrating analyses. And John did have a career in California. He worked as a research analyst for the California State Legislature before beginning his journalism career. And very grateful that you flew out here to do this. And John, let me introduce the others first and then turn it to you. Sitting next to John is David Gamage, who's assistant professor of law at Bolt Hall. And David is currently finishing a two-part project analyzing how state tax, turn the page here. Oops, sorry. Didn't think I memorized this, sorry. State tax systems should respond to fiscal volatility and the resulting budget crises, and we are confronting precisely that kind of a crisis right now. Previously taught at the University of Texas at Austin Law School. He is a JD from Yale, where he served as a senior editor on the Yale Law Journal, and as Law and Economics follows. And anybody who knows the hierarchy of law schools knows that someone who went to Yale Law School and was a senior editor of the Yale Law Journal is one very sharp cookie. So David, welcome. Isaac Martin, sitting next to David, is assistant professor of sociology at UC San Diego, and he is the inspiration for this event, and he's the author of The Permanent Tax Revolt, How the Property Tax Transformed American Politics, just published by Stanford. But I will say that he was well-trained, receiving his PhD here at the University of California, Berkeley, right? So okay. And finally, someone who I think everyone who reads about California politics knows extremely well, Peter Schrag, who has written for many years just wonderful articles in the Bee about California, and he's the author of two excellent books, or more books than two, but two recent books, Paradise Lost, California's Experience, America's Future, and that's a major study of Proposition 13. So I think we have a really stimulating set of people here, and the presentations will be about 15 minutes each, and then we'll throw you into the lions.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you. It's obligatory for a speaker to say it's a pleasure to be before an audience. In my case, it's truly genuine. First of all, I'm from the Wall Street Journal. I suspect many of you read it or subscribe to it. So the least I can do is come and thank you for helping to pay my salary, which you do. Secondly, I grew up in Northern California. Even though I've been in exile on the East Coast below these many years, it's still home. I come back as often as I can, and I am very pleased to be back here, especially since everything around me reminds me of how much I love this place. I wanted to begin by suggesting that Prop 13 had a profound impact in my life. It taught me an awful lot about what I learned about politics very quickly in one short summer. I was an intern in the California State Legislature. I was 19 years old, or 20 years old, and it was the summer of '78. And I remember it was late May, and Paul Priolo, who was the Republican leader, came back and had an informal meeting with the legislative Republicans. And for some reason, I managed to get in with the staffers, and I actually observed a watershed moment in California history. Paul Priolo stood up, and literally his hands were shaking. He had just come back from a town hall meeting in Ventura County, which he represented. And he said, I've been holding these town hall meetings for years. And he said, I was there to explain to them that Prop 13 would be a disaster. Remember, out of 120 California state legislators, only 4 endorsed Prop 13. It was complete bipartisan opposition to it, almost complete bipartisan opposition. And Priolo said, I stood up before 800 people, the greatest number that had ever shown up at a town hall meeting, and I said to them, if Prop 13 passed, it would decimate local services. It would destroy their schools. It would lead to disaster. I mean, I almost used biblical language. And I said to them in my final oration, I said, if you vote for this abomination, you will end local government as you know it. And he said, and then I got my first standing ovation ever at a town hall meeting. He said, I knew something was wrong. And he said, he looked out at this group of Republicans, legislators, and said, guys and gals, we're in trouble. It's time for us to follow, not to lead. It taught me something very valuable about politics. Our political leaders say they're leaders. In reality, they're mostly followers. And that applies to both political parties. Prop 13 had a profound impact nationally. Not only did it set off the tax revolt, Ronald Reagan was paying very close attention to Prop 13. Ronald Reagan helped create the conditions which led to Prop 13. He had raised taxes by over $1 billion, which was real money back then, in his first year as governor. Rather than confront the legislature, he decided to raise taxes, the largest tax increase in California's history. And Reagan had opposed or stood aside, well, a lot of property tax reform measures had been proposed in the early 1970s by various people. And Reagan's governorship, in part, where government spending went up dramatically, in part led to the conditions that created Prop 13. But Reagan, being a very canny politician, watched Prop 13 and said, well, I know which direction this tax thing is going now. And he said, I'm going to make tax reduction the centerpiece of my presidential campaign in 1980. It was after Prop 13 that he embraced Kemp Roth, which was the great income tax cut of 1981, and he put it as a centerpiece of his campaign. He won based partly on that, and that changed in part American fiscal history nationally. Now, my goal here today is to be descriptive more than prescriptive. And here's where the audience participation part of this comes in. To help me in my comments, I'd like to ask the audience one question. How many of you here in this room today would vote for Proposition 13? 6. Well, now I know what audience I'm dealing with. One of the hardest things in politics is trying to understand political trends you profoundly disagree with. It's very hard. Political scientists try to do it, even they have trouble wrestling. Journalists try to do it, they have trouble wrestling. I'm not an expert at this. I have my biases, I have my prejudices, but I have tried to wrestle with this, and here's the fruits of my labor. In 1929, we had a crisis of capitalism, the Great Depression. We can argue about its sources and its causes and how much the New Deal helped. There's a great new book by Amity Shlaes called The Forgotten Man, which I commend to your attention. But clearly it was viewed as a crisis of capitalism. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to do something. People were very insecure in their lives, especially senior citizens. And as you know, in politics, senior citizens are very concerned about security, and they vote in much higher numbers, as Mark DiCamillo would remind us, than the rest of the population. Security and the attitudes of senior citizens are always at the heart of American politics. Roosevelt tapped into that. The Social Security program, a social safety net, for those people in their retirement years. Now, admittedly, the average age of death at that time was 65, so Roosevelt was very cleverly proposing a program that most people wouldn't benefit from at the time. He didn't foresee the great life expectancy increases, but it was an extremely popular program. It was passed overwhelmingly. It was cemented into law in 1935. Now, conservatives and Republicans hated this program. They absolutely hated it. Business hated it because rather than have the taxpayer pay all of the cost, half of it was hidden because it was an employer tax, even though ultimately it was going to be passed on in the form of lower wages to employees. But business hated it. For 40, 50 years, there was a constant sub-theme of trying to undermine Social Security, trying to destroy Social Security. And the Republican Party kept running up against the rocks and being destroyed because of it. It became the third rail of American politics. What people didn't understand, coming at it from the right, was this was a security issue, this was considered a basic tenet of our social safety net, and it was not going to be touched. It could be supplemented, you could certainly have 401k plans, IRAs, all those things that were invented in the 70s and 80s, but Social Security was inviolate. And if anyone discovered that, it was President George W. Bush in 2005 who decided to even broach the idea of taking a couple percentage points from the payroll tax and allowing workers to invest in basically mutual funds and relatively safe investments in the stock market to get a higher return. That went nowhere. In fact, it went nowhere so fast it never even got a vote in a House or Senate committee. It went much less further than even Hillary Clinton's health care reform plan of 1994. So Social Security was a done deal. Now, in the future, yes, it's true, 25 nations have adapted private pension programs, but all of them are parliamentary democracies, a far different mechanism by which to affect social change than we have. So for the future, I think there is a private pension future, but the basic Social Security system is inviolate. Now, where does this take us to Prop 13? Things change. In the 1970s, no longer was it a crisis of capitalism, it was a crisis of government. People felt, especially after Vietnam, especially after Watergate, especially after the Great Society programs often were viewed as failures, or at least not fulfilling their promise, there was a crisis of confidence in government. As a result, when property taxes went sky high, when the budget went sky high in the 1970s, people reacted against that, especially senior citizens seeking security. Especially people who were fearful, even if it wasn't a real fear, that they would be forced out of their homes by rising property taxes. They sought security. Prop 13, in its own way, was a search for security just as much as the search for Social Security was a desire for security of people's old age. People say their home is their castle. One of the biggest things that matter to people in their golden years is the safety of their home. Now, as a result of this, I think liberals and Democrats and opponents of Prop 13 have made a political miscalculation. For 30 years, they have tried to batter down the doors and dismantle Prop 13 or modify it. Their efforts, frankly, were as doomed as the efforts to change Social Security because it was considered part of the basic social fabric of California after it passed. All you have to do is look at the poll numbers you just saw to see that. Those numbers are demonstrative. You may not like them, but they're real, and you should understand them rather than just fight against them. Now, I think Prop 13 could be modified. There are things that could be improved in Prop 13. There are flaws that are bigger now than they were 30 years ago. But rather than meet people halfway, rather than meet the proponents or the supporters of Prop 13 halfway, I think the opponents have often taken what I would call the Brezhnev theory of political science. Leonid Brezhnev was once asked about Eastern Europe under communism, and he said, what's ours is ours and what's yours is negotiable. Well, with Prop 13 it is, let's dismantle Prop 13 because it's destroying the social egalitarianism and communitarianism of California. Let's dismantle it. But what are you going to give the supporters of Prop 13? They represent 70% of the people. You have to give them something in a political compromise or else you're not going to get anything. What did they do instead? They dismantled the GAN limit in 1990. The GAN limit was a very simple proposal. It said government can grow based on inflation and population growth, but if you go beyond that, you have to seek a vote of the people. It worked to contain California's state budget in the 1980s. We didn't have great fiscal crises in California in the 1980s, except for the recession year of 1982, when George Duke Majan and Willie Brown had their famous fight. But in general, it was a period of relative calm. After it was taken off in 1990, the state budget went up. Now, I know that we're going to hear a lot of doleful talk about the increases in pressure on state and local governments because of Prop 13. Many of those problems are real. But let's look at the big picture first, before we look at the little picture. Between 1978 and 2003, the first 25 years of Prop 13, state school district spending, school district revenue, per student and adjusted for inflation and population, increased 30% after inflation and population. The schools may be hurting. They may be hurting in part because there are more administrative personnel and fewer teachers in the classroom. There may be other reasons why they're hurting, and I certainly am not gainsaying that. But revenue is up 30% in real terms. That's from until 2003. State government revenue increased 25% after inflation and population. City governments, the local governments that were supposedly decimated by Prop 13, up 20%. Now, what's happened since 2003? The state budget was $77 billion in 2003. It's now over $100 billion, an increase of 37%. Inflation in those 5 years has been 15%. Population growth, you had another 6%. 21% growth you would predict for inflation and population. The state budget is up 37%. The state government continues to grow faster than population and inflation. Supporters of Prop 13 look at that and say, well, maybe there's a compromise here. Maybe we could make some adjustments in Prop 13. But wouldn't it make sense to perhaps contain the state budget deficit of $14 to $20 billion? Wouldn't it perhaps have been a much less problem if we'd kept the Gann Amendment? If we'd had government grow on the basis of inflation and population, and if you wanted to grow it faster, you just have to get a vote of the people. And that gives you a much greater consensus for those increases. But I suspect that kind of grand political compromise is not in the cards. We will continue to remain two camps, those who blindly support Prop 13 and those who blindly are antagonistic towards it. I'll just conclude by saying this. On a personal note, Prop 13 really did mean security for a lot of people. It enabled my mother to stay in her house for the last 30 years. She died only 2 weeks ago. She wanted to be at this conference. She wanted to be here because she felt Prop 13 was very much an expression of American exceptionalism. And that's what I want to leave you with. Even though you may not think it, just as much as you think Social Security is part of the fabric of American security for a lot of people and part of our social safety net, Prop 13, perhaps to a different voting group, perhaps in a different way, Prop 13 is just as much a symbol of security for those people. Because let me tell you, some people would have been forced out of their homes in the late 1970s. And Proposition 8 was a pale and tepid last-minute attempt. It would never even have passed the legislature if Prop 13 hadn't been on the ballot. And Jesse Unruh, of all people, helped hammer Prop 13 home when he admitted the state was sitting on a $6 billion surplus. When government fails as much as it did in the mid-1970s, failing in different ways than government failed in the early 1930s, you're going to get a populist reaction. Now, populism is a bad name in American politics. It's associated with demagoguery and high emotion. But populism, properly understood, is also an authentic expression of grassroots sentiment. That is what the drive for Social Security was all about. That also was what the drive for Proposition 13 was about. Thank you.
As I navigate my way up here. So it's been said that California has experienced a fiscal roller coaster after the last 2 decades. I think no one in this room will be surprised to hear we are currently in a down part of that roller coaster. But the emphasis here I want to make in my comments is not up or down, but the roller coaster itself and its connection to Prop 13. So I'm going to provide some normative theory on why this fiscal roller coaster might be harmful, its connection to Prop 13 and the movements and propositions that followed from Prop 13, and finally a few minutes on what might be done about this. To begin with, though, let's separate notions of budget crises, fiscal roller coasters, and fiscal volatility, where there's notions of why these might be harmful that could be identified as partisan. And of course, gender a partisan's reactions on the other side. So I suspect the majority in this audience is of the camp thinking that a real problem with Prop 13 is restrictions on the ability to fund services. And I'm not here to disagree with that, but that's not the thrust of my talk. The thrust here is whatever the steady state level of taxes and spending we might want to have, we have to separate questions of what are we going to do, what should we do across economic cycles, from questions of what do we do as the economy cycles, and predictably we have upturns and downturns, and uncertainty and volatility that result from these upturns and downturns that need to be coped with, whether one is a conservative Republican, an anti-tax movement person, or a Berkeley professor, with inclinations toward the opposite side. So why is it, even if perhaps we think that the overall state of the budget should be reduced, spending should be reduced, that volatility should be thought to be harmful? And the answer to this question partly depends on what we do with volatility. If volatility is coped with by raising and lowering tax rates, it's well understood in economic theory that higher tax rates during some periods create more additional harm than lower tax rates during other periods resolve. So the economic harm that results from taxation is much lower if we have steady tax rates over a period of years than if we fluctuate the tax rates up and down. Another way of saying this is that the harm from taxation is not linear with respect to the tax rate. It's higher when tax rates are higher as opposed to lower. The same is likely true, although there's more dispute in this in economic theory, with respect to government spending. But there's reason to think that the benefit that government spending has for the economy, irrespective of the taxes needed to pay for it, is also nonlinear. Thus, when we increase government spending above its average level, we're getting less bang for our buck than we got with the first whatever amount of government spending that we had in lower downturns. So whether we allocate volatility by fluctuating tax rates or by fluctuating spending, there's reasons to think this volatility is harmful. Additionally, on both the private sector side and the government spending side, we have fixed costs or consumption commitments. It's hard in the face of uncertainty when private sector individuals or government sector program planners need to allocate expenses over a long run, many of which expenses cannot be easily reversed to deal with this uncertainty, and we get far less efficiency in government programs due to volatility, and also in private sector spending, we get less of efficiency on the private sector decisions, whether that's an individual household owner not knowing what size house to buy, businesses not knowing what size investments to build, or school districts not knowing what investments to build. So finally, on normative theory, if we have to choose between allocating volatility to tax rates or to spending, traditional notions of risk analysis suggest that we might be better off allocating more of this volatility to the private sector by fluctuating tax rates. The reasons for this are manifold, but briefly, one main reason is that the private sector is just much larger as a percent of the economy in California and any state than is the private sector. The private sector is larger than is government spending. So overall, there's much more slack in the private sector than in the public sector. Also, the overall balances of taxes and spending tend to be somewhat progressive in California, and wealthier individuals and actors tend to find it easier to deal with volatility than less wealthy individuals and actors who tend to be the benefits of many of these private sector programs. But there's also many political restraints on reallocation of funds in the public sector that don't exist in the private sector. So finally, we might also think that budget crises present somewhat of a problem in that they create gridlock. Now, to the extent that this is a problem partly depends on whether or not we think the government should be doing more or less. But if we think that there are real problems that the government needs to solve, having regular and repeated government budget crises every decade interferes with other things the legislator might do. So if fiscal volatility is a problem, and again, irrespective of where we sit in the partisan divide, the next question is, what does this have to do with the theme of the conference? What does Prop 13 have to do with creating the fiscal volatility problems we've seen over the last 2 decades? And the theme here is that Prop 13 is an instance in creating a fiscal constitution for California that we've seen increasingly in many states, but in particularly in California. By a fiscal constitution, I mean, and the literature suggests, that the legislature just doesn't get to decide what tax and spending policies we should have any given year. Instead, we have a complicated arrangement of restraints on what the legislator should do, and the median preference of the legislature, or median voter, does not determine policy in any given year. However, in contrast to what we think of as the Constitution at the federal level, the California Fiscal Constitution is much more malleable. It's comparatively easy, as I'm sure we all know in California, to pass constitutional amendments and to change this fiscal constitution at any given time. So the key features of the fiscal constitution are that propositions matter for determining policy, legislatures have constrained ability to act, but that the overall nature of the fiscal constitution is uncertain and can be changed by appeals to the voters through propositions. So how did Prop 13 help create this problem? Well, there are essentially 2 ways. First, by reducing California's reliance on property taxes, which had the effect of increasing reliance on income taxes, sales and excise taxes, and a variety of special fees at both the local and state level, and a whole variety of things, we have a much more volatile revenue structure than we had in the past, or than exists in almost any other state. Income taxes tend to be much more volatile as the economy transitions, as do these special fees and excise taxes. Additionally, although property taxes are somewhat volatile, they are less volatile than these other taxes, but more importantly, they move at different times. Where income taxes, capital gains taxes, special excise taxes all tend to go up and down at similar times, property taxes follow somewhat their own path. So just as financial planners in your own portfolios are advised to diversify your investments, and an investment that operates differently from the stock market is highly valued, even if it has a lower overall rate of return, property taxes as a part of the state fiscal mix had a significant impact in lowering overall volatility. And by moving away from property taxes, we've moved in a direction that has made us a state with one of the most volatile fiscal structures in the nation. But additionally, Prop 13 is important not just for its impact on property taxation, but because it heralded a new set of restrictions, supermajority requirements at the state level, and voter approval requirements at the local level, on what the legislature can do in order to change fiscal scenarios, raise taxes in a downturn, for instance. Now, Prop 13 is one of a package of measures that's have had these effects, and Prop 13's impact has been amended. But if we look at Prop 13 as part of the fiscal constitution that's been amended over time, we can see that the legislature is far more constrained than it was 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and more constrained than many of the legislatures and state political environments in other states. What this has created, particularly due to supermajority requirements, it's made it far harder for states to adjust to changing fiscal conditions. So the required political support needed to impact a major fiscal change is much higher as a result of these conditions, and we tend to see delaying of action, increased borrowing, various use of gimmicks. So far, at least in these downturns, we've managed to live with these gimmicks and borrowing. That's partly because this downturn in this decade has been relatively minor. The question happens, what happens if it occurs, though? What happens if we have a more serious recession at some point in the future? Will the borrowing that we've seen up to this point be sufficient, or will the borrowing just herald a larger fiscal crisis once the recession fully materializes due to the delay in actions? So finally, can we do anything about these repeated fiscal crises that are likely to appear in the future, both upturns and downturns, in a world in which, as we've heard suggested, Prop 13 and related measures are unlikely to be overturned? We've had some discussion in this cycle, particularly from Schwarzenegger, about moves to increase saving during upturns, of increased funding in rainy day programs, or creating new programs that mandatorily take excess revenues during upturns and reserve them for downturns. Generally, these measures are great. The problem is our historical experience has been they haven't worked that well. And there's lots of reasons to think that we should not expect them to be a full solution to this problem. Briefly, these reasons include legislative budget analysts and private sector budget analysts as well have tended to be predictably overly optimistic during upturns and overly pessimistic during downturns over time. And there's reason to expect this to continue. Additionally, to have a rainy day fund that comes anywhere close to being fully funded, you have to continue to add money to the fund as the state economy is declining from a peak. So while we're still above the average level of over cycles, but we're declining from the peak, you still have to be adding revenue to the fund, even though voters are feeling real pain because their economic prospect is declining based on prior years. So there's going to be large political demand to use the fund at a period where you need to continue adding to it. So for these and other reasons, although I support many of the measures that are suggested to increase funding of rainy day funds, we shouldn't expect them to be a full solution. In some of my scholarship, I've suggested another partial proposal for resolving some of these problems would be to rethink what we view as our steady state of tax revenues. Right now, for most of our state tax systems, the default is to have the tax rates remain constant as the economy cycles. But it's possible to have alternatives where revenues from the tax systems would remain constant, and we would view a tax hike as any increase in targeted revenues, perhaps indexed for inflation or other measures, so that the natural response as the economic cycle continues, it would be for tax rates to fluctuate while revenues remains more or less constant. The idea here is this would naturally relieve some of the pressures during upturns that create unsustainable increased spending or unsustainable tax cuts, while during downturns we wouldn't have this budgetary crises to the same degree. Whether any of these solutions could be more than a partial addresses to these problems, I'm not overly optimistic. But our fiscal constitution has continued to evolve over the last few decades, and there's reasons to think it'll continue to evolve over the future. We need to think proactively about constructing our fiscal constitution not only to address partisan goals, whether that be to reduce the size of government, whatever that means, or to lock in spending in desired areas, but we should also think in constructing a fiscal constitution for nonpartisan goals of managing budget crises, whatever our partisan lines. Of these ideas and more that others hopefully will think of should be a major part of the political debate. Thank you.
Slides? Do you happen to know if they're loaded on here?
I think they are.
All right.
Janine, I think the PowerPoint is set up for you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Right. Thanks very much. I noticed that Jack cleverly lined us up on the panel from right to left, with John Fund on the right and Peter Schrag on the left, and put me and David Gamage in the middle. So I was actually delighted to discover how completely I was in agreement with a lot of what John Fund said. Now, most of this conference, we're going to be talking about impacts of Proposition 13 on California. But observers at the time saw it as an event that was bigger than California. The nation was said to be in the grip of Proposition 13 fever. Proposition 13 was a symbol that the times were changing, and as I think John Fund's talk suggested, even more than that, people saw it as an event that helped to bring about the change. Well, if this is true, then it's important for understanding the impacts of Proposition 13. Much of what we think we know about the economic and fiscal impacts of this initiative come from studies that compare California to other states, on the assumption that we can treat this comparison as something like a natural experiment. But if the impact of Proposition 13 spilled over state borders, then this research strategy will tend to underestimate its impact. First of all, because it leaves out the impact on other states. And second, because spillover contaminates the natural experiment. It's as if you did a medical experiment but accidentally gave the control group medicine with their placebo. You might conclude that the medicine didn't have much effect on the treatment group, only because you're comparing them to another group that actually got a bit of the medicine too. So there are a lot of reasons to think that Proposition 13 may indeed have spilled across state borders. Howard Jarvis was certainly happy to claim that it had. He called it the shot heard around the nation and took credit for inspiring subsequent tax cuts in other states. The liberal journalist Robert Kuttner published a book in 1980 that described how property tax protesters in other states actually copied the text of the Jarvis Initiative and tried to write it into their own state constitutions, in some cases successfully. But other liberals at the time doubted that it had much impact and pointed out that at least half of the Jarvis-style initiatives in other states were defeated. When I started doing research on the Property Tax Revolt some 8 years ago, I had a conversation with a professor here in Barrows Hall who recalled that everyone had expected a wave of property tax limits to follow Proposition 13 in other states, and he wondered aloud why it had never happened. Well, of course, it did happen. This map shows all the states that passed property tax limitations in the 100 years before Proposition 13. The map includes regular statutes and initiative statutes and constitutional amendments. It omits a lot of progressive-era laws that simply limited the property tax rate, unless, like Proposition 13, they also limited the increase of the total property tax levy. As you can see, we had 9 states enacting property tax limits in the 100 years before Proposition 13, or fewer than 1 per decade. After Proposition 13, the pace picked up a little bit. 16 states in 10 years, more than 1 per year. Leaving us with a landscape pretty much as it looks today. The bulk of the states that have property tax limitations today passed them in the wake of Proposition 13, although few are as restrictive as Proposition 13. Looked at another way, here's the cumulative number of states with property tax limitations. These are limitations on the growth of local property tax levies. It resembles the classic S-shaped diffusion curve that sociologists have found in studies of social contagion in other areas, studies of how people imitate each other in adopting innovations from hybrid seed corn to fax machines to pharmaceuticals. One difference from the familiar S-curve is that there's a kink in the curve in 1978, a noticeable point of inflection when the rate of increase, the pace of innovation began to increase dramatically. I'll give you 3 guesses what that was. The graph depicts a wave of property tax limitations that washed over the states after Proposition 13. But how much of this wave was because of Proposition 13? Well, not all of it. And there are a couple reasons we know that it's not all of it. First of all, we've seen that other states actually had limitations that were in some respects similar before Proposition 13. The pace of limitation began to pick up in the early 70s before Proposition 13. And there were a lot of other trends that might have contributed to this wave of property tax limitations. Rates of home ownership were increasing, making more people sensitive to property taxes. The cost of public schools was increasing. Average incomes were increasing, making voters more affluent and, over time, more conservative. Now, I've tried to control for these and other factors in some statistical models I estimated, and other factors including public opinion towards the property tax, partisan control of state legislatures, and you can read the gory details in an appendix of my book. With all of these adjustments, here was the annual risk of passing a property tax limit in an average state in the decade before Proposition 13. That's close to 0. Here's the annual risk after Proposition 13 in a comparable state. No other year was a comparable turning point in the models I estimated. Proposition 13, 1978, seems to have been a real turning point in the spread of these laws. Now, this evidence rules out some other explanations for the spread of property tax limits, but it doesn't clinch the case that Proposition 13 was the vector of contagion, that this was really Proposition 13 fever. If it's true that Proposition 13 caused this wave of limits, we should actually find qualitative evidence. We should find some evidence in the historical record, discussions of politicians, discussions among activists in other states as they assess their strategies. We should find evidence that they actually looked to Proposition 13 for guidance, and that is indeed what we find. Let me just choose two examples to illustrate two different ways that Proposition 13 fever spread. First, Proposition 13 led conservative activists in other states to embrace the cause of property tax limitation because they saw it as a winnable demand. Consider Massachusetts. There's a great example here. A conservative grassroots organization called Citizens for Limited Taxation had been campaigning for years to limit state taxes and failing. And then Proposition 13 passed. The executive director of the group later said, "We were watching Proposition 13 very carefully. We were thinking that if this goes over well in a liberal state like California, perhaps we should try it in Massachusetts." They did try it. The result was, of course, Proposition 2.5, the property tax limitation that passed in Massachusetts in 1980. A second way that the fever spread was by changing the calculations of politicians directly. Even liberals and moderates in office embraced property tax limits in many cases because it was a politically viable solution to a real crisis of rising property tax rates, a real problem of income security for their constituents, as John Fund pointed out. It wasn't their most preferred solution, but Proposition 13 proved it was a winning solution. And a great example here is Michigan Governor William Milliken, a moderate Republican. In 1976, Milliken had actually campaigned against tax limitation. He had sided with the state's school officials. But a week after Proposition 13 passed, he changed his position. Correspondence from a campaign contributor may have swayed him here. One of his largest donors urged the governor to support a reasonable tax limitation because the alternative was what he called an extreme cutback in revenues like California's Proposition 13. Milliken decided it was good advice. There were two tax limitation initiatives on the ballot in Michigan that year. Milliken embraced the more moderate of the two and won re-election. This was the Headley Amendment, a general limit on state taxes and also on local property taxes that illustrates a final way that Proposition 13 spread. It didn't just spill over into other states, it also spilled over into limits on other taxes. Before 1978, limits on the growth of state spending and limits on the growth of the local property tax were actually seen as separate issues, fundamentally different kinds of policy. Governor Ronald Reagan of California, for example, had supported a limit on the growth of the state budget, but had repeatedly come out against local property tax limitations like Proposition 13. After June 1978, conservatives like Reagan decided to package those issues together, to couple property tax limits with state tax limitation, and rhetorically to associate the cause of state tax limits with the cause of property tax limitation. Lou Euler, actually, who helped to draft Governor Reagan's failed state tax limitation initiative, circulated a letter to other anti-tax activists right after Proposition 13, telling them to do this. He said, "My cumulative experience has led me to revise the tax limitation model. Now we should call it property tax and state tax limitation. And we should place the property tax reduction and limitation sections up front whenever we draft one of these initiatives, to deal head-on with control over local property tax assessments, to remove that as an issue, and to ride the political momentum occasioned by the property tax revolt that's gripping California." It worked. State tax limitation did benefit from the momentum occasioned by Proposition 13. Here, from a similar statistical model to the one I ran for property tax limitation, here was the annual probability that an average state would pass a limit on the growth of a state budget, on the growth of the state budget, before Proposition 13, and here's the annual rate of passage after Proposition 13. As before, these are predicted probabilities. I'm controlling for a lot of other factors, confounding factors, including the state tax burden, including the party controlling the state legislature, and many others. This effective timing is actually the only factor I've found that had any measurable predictive power for predicting when and whether a state would pass one of these tax and expenditure limitations. It seems if we're to explain the spread of state tax limits at all, we have to explain it at least in part as a process of contagion, as Proposition 13 fever. So what? Well, one answer is that much of the best scholarship on the economic and fiscal impacts of Proposition 13 understates those impacts, as I've said, because it considers only impacts of property tax limitation in California. Proposition 13 spilled over from California into other states. It spilled over from the property tax into other policies. And we have even begun to accumulate evidence that it spilled over from the state arena, as John Funn said, into federal fiscal policy as well. As political historians and students of American political development in political science and sociology, turn our attention now to the 1970s and 1980s, which is now beginning to be seen as history. Right? We're finding actually new evidence from archives that are opening up and new evidence from oral histories and so forth, that Proposition 13 really was a pivotal moment. It really did change how Congress perceived public opinion and thereby changed how Congress behaved. There are recent monographs by sociologists named Monica Prasad and Brian Steensland, for example, that show evidence that Proposition 13 shaped congressional debates over federal income tax policy, that Proposition 13 shaped federal debates over welfare reform. So that's one reason to care. Another is that this tells us something about what's at stake today. When we debate whether and how to reform Proposition 13, and when we debate what to do about our state and local budgeting process in general, Californians like to flatter ourselves that we're trendsetters. Well, the lesson of Proposition 13 is that at least sometimes we really are. When we sneeze, other states sometimes catch cold. In other words, we don't just owe it to each other to make good policy, we owe it to everyone else as well. And I look forward to learning more from our discussion today and this afternoon about what the best policy should be. Thank you very much.
No, it's all right. I'm okay. It's always nice for me to be in Berkeley because in most parts of Berkeley I feel like a conservative. Even though I'm the right wing, left wing of this panel. Earlier Jack Citrin said that Prop 13 kind of divides people between the party of doom and the party of deliverance, and I guess I belong more to the party of doom. But I think we all agree that Prop 13 indeed changed the political climate, and not only in California, but as others have pointed out in this country. And I think it's changed it in many ways. That certainly there was a national wave, as we've just heard, in Massachusetts, in Michigan, in New Jersey, in scores of other states, many other states. Yes, Ronald Reagan, I think, did trade on the anti-tax climate. Some people even believe that Margaret Thatcher picked up on the anti-tax climate in Great Britain. We've had, Americans have always been, nobody likes to pay taxes. Americans have always, as Joel Fox often reminds me, this country began with a tax revolt, but it was, of course, a tax imposed by somebody 3,000 miles away, so it wasn't quite the same thing. But we certainly have always had the suspicion of taxes. But I think we've never had it quite with the virulence that we've had in the last generation. And if you think about, for example, the Bush tax cuts at the beginning of as we were going into the war, that's never happened before in this country, that we cut taxes in wartime. The rise and the triumph of Grover Norquist, the fear of the T word. We have Barack Obama promising middle-class tax cuts which seems to me rather interesting for a Democrat. And then, of course, we have all the things, the progeny of Prop 13 in California. We had the GAN spending limits, which were passed in 1979. We had indexing of the income tax. We had the abolition of the inheritance tax. We had measures, John Fund may be able to benefit from this, allowing parents to pass their homes on to their children with no tax increase, which has kind of created a sort of landed nobility in California. And of course, we had a whole range of other fiscal measures. One of the ones that I find most interesting is Proposition 98, the formula that governs school funding in California, which was passed actually as a result of the GAN spending limit after Governor Deugmajian refunded $1 billion to taxpayers in I'm getting my centuries mixed up, in 1987, because he thought that we were about to go over the spending limit, so taxpayers got $1 billion back, but of course at the expense of the schools, as a result of which the school lobby engineered Proposition 98 to guarantee a minimum amount of funding for schools, which is, of course, has bedeviled California school budgets and school funding ever since. We had the Planning and Conservation League running a bunch of park and transit bonds that were basically ballot box budgeting measures. We had the three-strike sentencing law, which added an enormous amount of a burden to the budget by basically growing prisons. We had Prop 218, which was designed to basically curb the tendency of local governments to impose fees and other exactions to get around some of the Prop 13 limits. We had the governor's Proposition 49, before and after school care. We had stem cell bonds imposing another $6 billion in debt on California. These are all things that were done at the ballot, and they're all the result of the growth largely as a result of Prop 13, though not entirely in resort to the initiative and the growing distrust and the often the paralysis of government imposed by various spending limits and revenue limits. Not all result of Prop 13, I should say. We have a bunch of other things that contributed to the coming of Prop 13, including the two-thirds vote required to pass budgets in California. That goes back to the 30s, and it might be that in 1977-78, when the legislature was partly fiddling and partly struggling to somehow respond to the pressure on homeowners caused by the rising assessments, I think the two-thirds limit had a certain amount to do with its inability to get there. What we have now as a result of all this, as you know, Governor Schwarzenegger, I should say one other thing about the changing climate, which I always found interesting. In 1962, when California became the largest state in the Union, sometime around 1962, we were recognized, or we thought of ourselves as this great, wonderful state of young families, young professionals sitting by the pool, enjoying life, and we were so represented in this great wave of media coverage that came in '62 in connection with this. By 1977, we were a state of aging homeowners who couldn't pay their taxes. Something had changed in the climate. Something funny went on, but certainly the great level of hope and aspiration and expectation was considerably diminished in the intervening 15 years. As we know now, Arnold Schwarzenegger is trying to dig out of all of those constraints, complaining mightily about autopilot formulas and spending, which he's right about, though he himself brought a couple of them on himself. He cut the vehicle license fee, another product of the tax cut climate, it seems to me, and to this day, of course, explains that our problem is not low revenues, it's excessive spending, but the VLF, of course, was a tax cut, even though it appears on the budget as spending because we have to backfill local governments for the money they used to get from the VLF. So, in fact, that is an expenditure and not, in fact, a tax cut and not an expenditure. As other people have pointed out, we've had a whole march of plebiscites in the intervening years. I don't need to list them all. Prop 187, Prop 227, Prop 209, minimum wage initiatives, various environmental initiatives, and what we've certainly had as a result is an increasing confusion by voters and by everybody about who's accountable for what. When the streets don't get paved, is it the fault of City Hall or is it the fault of Sacramento, which now controls the property tax as a result of Prop 13? And all of this mushing together of local and state government, which was a problem even before 13, but it certainly became a more serious problem in the years since, where people really don't know who's accountable and which of the rascals you want to throw out if something doesn't work. There's been lots of talk about the inequity of property tax bills. The new kid on the block pays way more than the person who's been there 20 or 30 years. Joel Fox and others say that it provides reliability and dependability for the homeowner rather than for the tax collector, which is true, but it is certainly still an inequity. It's probably more of an inequity with regard to commercial property, where it becomes hard to compete with somebody, or it becomes harder to compete with somebody who's been there and has been paying property taxes for 30 years on the basis of assessments of 30 years or 20 years, while the new business, whatever it is, across the street would have to pay property taxes on a much higher level. There was a beginning of a lawsuit in the 80s that Macy's brought because it felt that it was being taxed at a much higher rate, and I can't remember who was down the street, Penny, somebody, partly as a result, maybe mainly as a result of enormous protests by Macy's customers, including a lot of shredded credit cards, which I'm told you guys helped organize, but maybe not. Anyway, it was organized by some organization that shall be nameless. Macy's dropped the suit. And then, of course, we have something that hasn't been discussed here yet today at all, which is the so-called fiscalization of land use, a fancy phrase which basically applies to the attempt of local governments to bend over backwards to bring in sales taxpayers, meaning shopping malls and auto malls and so on, which do pay probably more than they cost the local government, and it's become a kind of an ongoing business of Peter robbing Paul and so on, and the result is that balanced planning for residences and business and transportation and so on begins to take a back seat to the chase for the sales tax dollar. Mark DiCamillo this morning pointed out that the voters, certainly judging from this latest poll, really don't point a path out of the state's quandary. It's a fiscal quandary, and of course, we like to have both our low taxes or our limited taxes and our high services, or what used to be high services. And I haven't talked about the level of service at all because that's a whole other thing. And certainly the schools have suffered, transportation and maintenance have suffered. and we can get into detail on that in terms of dollars. I kind of demur from John Fund's conclusion that our schools are being funded just fine. Maybe that's not what you plan to say. Okay, they're just getting more money than they used to, and that's true. Most of us are getting more money than we used to. My doctor is getting a hell of a lot more money than he used to. It is a problem, but I don't want to get into it because, as I say, I think the more serious problem isn't the limits on financing. It's the total distortion of the governmental process and the sense of accountability and where it belongs. I think it reinforces the distrust of elected government. It weakens it, and I think it started a cycle of governmental paralysis, partly caused by either constraints put in by initiatives or by government's own hesitancy to act because it fears something else will come down on it, and particularly in an atmosphere where tax increases are anathema, excuse me. Essentially, initiative begets paralysis, begets more initiatives. And of course, these days, the players in the initiative game are the very people that the initiative process was originally designed to control. And the only people who get to play, really, at this point, to get to the table are people with deep pockets. There's the famous remark that Tom Hiltack, a Republican lawyer in Sacramento, has made over and over again over the years when people have come in and wanted to run something on the ballot. And he said, well, let me ask you the $1 million question. And they said, what's that? And he said, have you got $1 million? Though now it's more likely to be $2 million. Anyway, the system which was designed to curb the rich now belongs to the rich. Of course, there's protection for homeowners, and I totally agree. But I think that protection could have been extended by the legislature in all sorts of ways. And the fact that it wasn't in '77 and that they fiddled and diddled, I don't think is conclusive. I think that what would have happened in California if, like 25 or 26 other states, there was no initiative process in 1978? Would we have had armed revolt? Would we have had geezers with pitchforks marching the streets of Sacramento? Or would, in fact, the message have gotten through that political year to the legislature, both to the people who were reelected and to the new people? And as you know, even with Prop 13, there were a lot of people who were elected as so-called Proposition 13 babies, who were part of a new generation that kind of that were a major force in Sacramento. In any case, I think the legislature and the governor, including Jerry Brown, would have gotten the message and would have dealt with it, I think, in a more reasonable and manageable way, and in a way that would have reinforced confidence in elected government rather than undermining it. We're now living with a no new tax theology. We have a party in Sacramento that, GOP in Sacramento, I should say, that seem to be totally locked into no new taxes no matter what. That's popular, I don't deny it. Again, Mark's data makes that clear. But somebody has to lead our way out of that. And somebody has to lead our way out of it at the national level, because we can't continue to fudge. We can't continue to borrow and fudge forever. And with the exception of Pete Wilson in 1991, who actually was willing to raise taxes in a balanced way, also with cuts, spending cuts, to balance the budget, we've really not had a serious talk about the trade-off between taxes and services in the state for a good many years. Those of you, again, who wonder about some of the data that Mark showed this morning, I recommend to you, and it's applicable both at the national and at the state level, a wonderful piece that a Princeton political scientist named Larry Bartels wrote about 8 years ago, called "Homer Gets a Tax Cut." If you look online, you can find it, and it basically explains why people don't understand that if they get a small tax cut, it may not be worth the loss in public services that they get down the road. Thanks very much.
I think we have a nice block of time for questions, so perhaps we could start by having the people on the panel, maybe if you have anything you want to comment, having heard each other, or raise a question, and then we can throw it open to the floor. No?
Well, I would just say that the impasse that Mark DiCamello's numbers indicate politically remains, which is knowing the sentiment in this audience, you want change. You want Prop 13 modified, but you have 70% of the people who don't agree with you. Only 6% of the people in this audience like Prop 13, so you have a gap. The way to bridge that gap is with a creative political compromise. I haven't heard that yet. You're going to have to give something up in order to get something that you want. That's how our system works. And one of the frustrating things I've noticed in California is there are all kinds of people who propose creative alternatives. Dan Walters from the Sacramento Bee is one of them, one of the best columnists in California. Dan Weintraub of the Sacramento Bee is another. It doesn't seem to get through the political gridlock. So we continue to have these two camps, people who blindly follow Prop 13 and people who blindly follow the opponents. My suggestion is it's incumbent upon the people who want change to make the first move. You've got to make the first move if you want change. We did away with the GAN limit in 1990. I think that could be viewed historically as a mistake. Look at our budget problem today. We wouldn't have it if we'd had the GAN limit in place. We wouldn't have had the previous budget disaster under Gray Davis if we'd had the GAN limit in place. Government spending could have gone up. You just would have had to make the case to the people. It's incumbent upon people who want to change Prop 13 to make the opening move towards a political compromise. I don't see enough movement to actually achieve what you want yet.
Let me pose a question. Maybe Peter, are you the best person to address this? Because among the other things that's happened, I think, in this post-1980 period is a change in the composition of the legislature, a change through term limits, another initiative of the experience and knowledge and the political incentives of people up there. And also, I think, the increased polarization of the parties. Now, these, I don't know to what extent that can be viewed as a result of Prop 13, but it's certainly a part of the new landscape, which suggests to me that that's another obstacle for anyone, any response, whether it's on your line or David's line or John's line. Do you have some sense about that?
Obviously, term limits, I wouldn't, I don't want to risk being accused of blaming everything on Prop 13, and I don't think term limits is a result of it, but term limits certainly was part of the wave of plebiscitary initiatives that was sort of opened up by Prop 13, and some of it, of course, I think the so-called initiative industrial complex began before 13, but it certainly grew great after 13, and I think that the polarized, I think the polarized atmosphere in Sacramento and in Washington, I think is a result of a lot of things that are not connected to any of those things. Particularly, I think they're connected partly to the new media and the rise of the new media and the sort of anti-establishment, anti-institutional media. They're obviously connected to some extent to the way that legislature is apportioned right now by itself, and the safe seats that are created. But term limits themselves are obviously antithetical to any long-term view by legislators, because you don't have to, if you're only going to be there for 6 years, why do you have to worry about what happens after you're gone? And I think there's a lot of that. So I think there's a lot of things going on that are only remotely connected to 13.
David, you wanted to?
Yeah, I want to say a little bit in response to John's remarks. I see something different when I look at the poll data. I see what we've known in public opinion research for a very long time, which is that if you give people a question about either taxes or spending in isolation, they are almost always against for lower taxes. And if you give them a very specific spending program, they're almost always for higher spending. It doesn't work if you say spending in general versus taxes, because spending in general doesn't have these cues. When I look at the polling data, I have no idea what would happen if you took a focus group of California voters that was a representative sample and had them try to make a real policy with trade-offs. So the question that John suggests that if we want change, we need to forward creative proposals, and I don't disagree with that. What I worry is that the incentives in the political system work exactly at the opposite direction right now. If it's in the case that voters, when an issue is framed narrowly, whether taxes or spending, you can very easily manipulate their responses. It's the attractive notion for people on either side of the spectrum is to try to frame the responses their way. And when it's very difficult for the legislature to reach compromise solutions due to 2/3 majority requirements and other impediments, and it's much easier to bring change through propositions, the incentives are for increased polarization. And I don't see how we get out of this.
David, look, we have a problem here, and it's one I don't like, it's one you don't like, but it's real. We're talking about political reality here. 20% of the population trust the legislature to do anything. Its numbers are as low among Democrats as it is among Republicans. Congress's rating is 22%, a major improvement. The people don't trust the legislature. They didn't trust them before term limits, they don't trust them now. That's a reality. So you got to deal with that. Yes, there may be an initiative industrial complex problem here. Well, the legislature can solve that. It can put its own referendums on the ballot. It has done that in the past. It can consult the voters because clearly it's not trusted. You want to put a specific spending proposal on the ballot? We do it all the time in California. We put bonds up. Almost all the bonds pass. You put some spending programs up, like Rob Reiner did. It passed. Governor Schwarzenegger tried this before he was in the recall campaign. It may have been gimmicky, but it passed. The point is, when you have public cynicism as high as we have, and confidence in the legislative and executive branches as low as we have, consulting the people is not necessarily a bad idea. The legislature can do it any time it wants. It doesn't have to have an initiative, doesn't have to wait for rich people to put an initiative on the ballot. It can do that. We have the initiative process to get around gridlock. That's why Hiram Johnson and the progressives of their day so favored the initiative, because they knew that vested interests of the right or left could capture the legislature, and they did if you look at the railroad history. So rather than argue against the initiative process, and I can certainly agree with parts of that, let's not argue with the vote of the people. The vote of the people may be the way that we finally break through the gridlock, because people can take their case to the people. The legislature can put anything it wants on the ballot at any time. It's up to them.
Okay, let's now get questions from the floor. Mark?
Please speak into the mic.
It's my perception, having lived in Berkeley since 1978, that Prop 13 may have contributed significantly to the gentrification that we see around here. And none of you has addressed that. I wondered if any of you thought about it and if you agreed that it had. That there's a rapidly diminishing middle class, certainly in Northern California, but I suspect in the state as a whole.
response. Oh, do you want to go?
I was going to speculate wildly in response to that question. So I haven't done research on sort of effects on home prices. It's not my area of expertise. But I just would point out that there's at least one mechanism by which we might actually expect Proposition 13 to reduce gentrification, which is to say that one of the ways that people get displaced by gentrification is when new homeowners move in, property taxes go up, right? And for long-term residents of an area. And as a consequence, people may be displaced by rising taxes that result from an influx of the gentry. Proposition 13 should break that mechanism in California. So at least that kind of displacement may actually be less likely to occur as a consequence. But other people here are more qualified
I think,
to
Bill,
talk.
Fischel, you have a response? Maybe you can help with that.
It isn't so much my personal knowledge of this as her question reminded me of a study I read a few years ago that suggested that Prop 13 may increase gentrification because now rich people don't have to worry about where they send their kids to school. They send their kids to private school in downtown San Francisco instead of having to go to Orinda and so it really has made rich people more footloose, and that makes gentrification in desirable areas where low-income people happen to live a lot easier to do. It's not my study, but it seemed persuasive to me.
I guess I would say we don't know. Because by the same token, Berkeley has rent control, which keeps people, in the same place forever, and makes it harder for the property to be converted into gentrified new condos or whatever it is. On the other hand, we see a lot of condos being built, so we don't know.
I like Mr. Schrag's analysis, but in the context of Mr. Fun, I think that he's got a good point, that somewhere along the way there has to be some more dramatic options rather than just polarization. And the data that you had from the survey, table 13, says cut to avoid Texas. Number one, 47%. Cutting the correctional system, what have you, and those of you who want to save, only 8% would save it, what have you. I think if that doesn't stick out like a possible avenue of change and a compromise, the idea of having 50,000 inmates released, this $7 billion bond issue coming for healthcare services, which some expect to be expected, we need to be able to offer something that says, hey, we need to rethink. To strike you out, like Mr. Schrag suggested, we need to have some kind of options whereby we realize that we can't have 100% security, we can't have our cake and eat it too, and Mr. Fun's comment that we need to maybe rethink as well as have something more dramatic. How dramatic is 47% to cut prison corrections when we have the opposite from the standpoint of the federal mandate right now? So,
well, I was struck also by Mr. DiCamillo's numbers as well. I think it's insane to have such a very limited approach to criminal justice for nonviolent offenders than to clap them in jail where they often are brutalized. I mean, I think one of the worst things ever said by a public official in California was when former Attorney General Lockyer said he would be happy when Ken Lay met Bruno in the prison and Bruno would brutalize him. I think that was one of the worst things that ever was said by a public official in California. Now, I think conservatives should look creatively at that. I think that it would be helpful if they led with more creative solutions to nonviolent offenders. I also think their liberals should lead. I just drove down from Sacramento. We had a mayor's race this Tuesday. Kevin Johnson, the former NBA star, led the runoff. It was an amazing campaign, which I witnessed the last few days. The teachers' union just brutalized him. I mean, there were incredible ads calling him a child molester and everything else under the sun. What was their biggest beef? He started a charter school, and he didn't necessarily want to invite the union in on day one to dictate the rule book. Maybe there can be some give on the teachers' unions, which, if you talk to Democratic governors, Democratic congressmen off the record, will tell you is one of the single biggest impediments to real education reform. I'm not talking about privatizing the schools. I'm talking about not giving one group inordinate control and authority over people. Because let me tell you what Al Shanker told me, the late teacher union leader of the American Federation for Teachers. He was very blunt. He said, we came and asked him, why in the world won't you support even modest school choice? And he said, you have this mistaken impression. By the way, this is on the record. You have this mistaken impression that we're here to represent the children. We're not. I'm a union leader. I'm here to represent the teachers. The day I will represent the interests of the children is the day they become members of my union. He said that. And he was one of the most reform-minded union leaders. And that's true. His job is to represent his members. My point is this. We need to get beyond education that we always say we need more spending for the children, when in reality, let's be honest here, a large chunk of that education is not for the children. A large part of that spending is not for the children, it's for the adults. Let's be honest about it. A large chunk of that education spending goes to the adults. It should be less. We should be more creative in the schools. Maybe we can combine prison reform with education reform. That might work.
I'm going to recognize Robin Einhorn. Oh, sorry. Then, John, you're next. Oh, you have the mic. Okay, Robin, you're next. You have the mic.
Okay, my impression is, as a number of the speakers have indicated, that Proposition 13 and its effects have morphed over time. And I think I can show that by offering a deal to the conservatives on the panel, okay? And I want to see if they'll take it. I will raise the percentage required to raise the property tax to 80% if you eliminate the supermajority on the rest of taxation. Anybody want to take that deal? See, because I think this thing has...
I have to think about ideas like that. I don't do instant analysis.
Oh, come on. You know what this is all about. This is about people who want big government versus people who want small government. And
I want effective government.
No. We all want effective government in the abstract. Show me a state that has effective government.
You name me one.
Probably Minnesota. Everything works in Minnesota, but it also has big government.
The governor's approval rating is 30%. The legislature's rating is 20%. They're very happy.
Look, James Q. Wilson said, never show a program in Minnesota because it always works, and never show a program in New York because it never works. Two big government states. What this is really about is big government versus small government. It's a question of taste. And although it started out because stupid Democrats refused to do something about raising assessments on property taxes, it's now essentially an argument of how many or how much services will you provide. And the dollars simply are things that you use as a budgeteer to provide services. Last year, for the first time in American history, spending on health care was greater at the state level than spending on schools. Okay? When that happens, health care is out of control, not because of government, but because of the health care sector. And all these people who simply talk about dollars are not talking about, are you going to be Mississippi and be Haley Barbour and solve your budget problem by kicking everybody off Medicaid? You know, it's a question of preferences and taste. And what we've done in California, basically, is to give the supermajority to conservatives. And we know from Beasley and Case in their econometric studies that the few states that have supermajorities have total state and local taxation that's 8 percentage points lower, holding everything else constant, than those states that don't have supermajorities. So we've morphed it from a question of kicking your mother out of her house to a question of how large will the public sector be in state and local government. And that's the real national question. You know, and Prop 13 is the vehicle for that in California, but it's really a national debate. Simple.
No response from the panel?
I thought it was a statement.
No, someone over here was next.
Hi, I'd like to offer a different deal. My deal is, how about we have a revenue-neutral way to make Prop 13 less regressive? I mean, that's the real problem, I think, with Prop 13, is the people can decide if they want bigger government, and I say this as a liberal. The people can decide if they want bigger government or lesser government. The problem is that this tax that's essentially a war by the old against the young, where the young are disproportionately non-white, the problem is that this tax is so unfair, is that Proposition 13 is a problem as a tax. And if we can just disentangle the unfairness of this tax from this other question of should taxes be higher or lower, then I think we could go a long way to solving some of the problems Peter Schrag was talking about. So my deal is a revenue-neutral way to make a fairer tax.
Well, I mean, if I don't know whether one is out of order to talk about the whole state tax structure, which is a mess, and a sales tax that no longer covers a good part of the state economy because so much of our economy is now in services rather than in goods. That doesn't cover sales on the internet because they got themselves a special deal. A whole set of taxes, a corporate tax that is full of loopholes and that are very hard to get out. My friend Lenny Goldberg always likes to say that the corporate tax loopholes are like a roach motel. Once they get in, they never get out. So there's a whole series of things that ought to be addressed, and I think and certainly the property tax may be part of it, but it may not be the most important part.
Yeah, in listening to your question, Robin, it just occurred to me that there have been efforts. There have been a couple of, not that long ago, big commissions on constitutional reform of California. Let's throw all of this on the table. Let's get rid of all of these initiatives that Peter has been talking about. Let's kind of redo this. And whenever these well-meaning people that include some of our colleagues, some of my colleagues in political science have subjected themselves to that feudal enterprise in the past. But usually what happens is, as I think others have said, is too many important groups benefit from the current system to give it up. They prefer, I think, the Rube Goldberg quality that Peter mentions to change. And until somehow that can be overcome, and it would have to be overcome through an appeal to the voters. Yeah. So time for one last question here.
The Quran this morning said that the figure that are in support of Prop 13 currently is about 56%. But my question is historical. Prior to the passing of Prop 13, was there a movement to separate out providing tax relief to single-family homeowners and not giving that same kind of welfare to corporations?
Well, I think the answer to that question, it goes back to the split roll issue, I think. Isn't that correct? Asking, was there a movement to tax properties of different rates? Yes, there was, and in fact, the legislature in the last minute put precisely that kind of a proposal on the ballot in order to help to try and defeat Proposition 13. It failed. It hasn't been seriously revisited since.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that laid the groundwork for 13 was reforms were instituted in the early 1970s when there was a general perception that local tax assessors were favoring commercial property and big property owners, which in fact they did on occasion, but not in general. But the result was that California passed a law that essentially then required assessments to be at the real assessment, whatever the real value was. The result was that, in fact, residential property, which had been favored by the tax assessors, was assessed at a higher level than it had been before, which is partly what drove or underlay the tax revolt in 1977-78. And there was even a famous bumper sticker in San Francisco after all of this happened that said, "Bring back the crooked assessor." And so it was there was a lot of confusion about property taxes.
John?
I would just say that I'm not a pollster, but I do play one on TV, and I'll do some back-of-the-seat analysis. You say the percentage for Prop 13 is 56% in the poll we heard today. Actually, he said 57. There's 20% that aren't sure. Most pollsters will, for back-of-the-envelope calculations, say that ultimately those not sure would break down roughly along the rest of the poll. So you'd see about 2/3 of the not sure going in favor of Prop 13 and about 1/3 not. Even if that weren't the case, you certainly can't look at the 23% that wouldn't vote for Prop 13 and call that much of a political coalition to build on. 23% is 23%, and it's not 50. So what Mr. DiCamillo said is the support for Prop 13, by his analysis, and I'm not trying to speak for him, but that's what I heard him say, is greater today or as great as it was in 1978.
I think that's true, and I think on that note we can have lunch and reassemble at 1 o'clock.
I have an announcement to make.